Kai had stopped counting rotations after the first 100. The station measured time in cycles, artificial days calibrated to Earth standard, despite being 17 light-years from anything resembling home. He'd been assigned to Verith Station because he'd scored high on pattern recognition and low on social integration needs. A perfect fit for mineral processing oversight in deep space, they'd said. Work that required precision and tolerance for isolation. Before the silence, he'd spent most shifts monitoring extraction algorithms, adjusting parameters, ensuring quotas were met. The Ithari, who supervised the operation, barely acknowledged his presence. Communication happened through the interface. Clean, efficient, wordless. He would feel the directive arrive in his consciousness, a gentle pressure that translated instantly to understanding, and he would comply. No friction, no misunderstanding. The interface made him competent in ways his natural abilities never had. He'd appreciated the simplicity. His quarters were small, temperature-controlled, stocked with protein bars and water rations that tasted of minerals and preservation. He slept 6 hours per cycle, worked 12, spent the remainder reading technical manuals or watching archived entertainment from Earth, shows about families, relationships, conflicts he barely understood. He watched them the way someone might study anthropology, observing behaviors from a comfortable distance. The other humans on Verith kept different schedules. He'd see them occasionally in the communal areas, recognize faces without names, exchange brief nods. They seemed louder than necessary, always gathering in groups, laughing at references he didn't catch. He'd learned early that his silence made them uncomfortable, that his inability to perform casual warmth registered as hostile. Easier to avoid them entirely. When the interface failed, Kai was in Sector 9, standing before a holographic display of mineral density readings. The sensation arrived without warning, a sudden absence where constant low-level connection had been, like losing a sense he hadn't known he was using. The display remained functional, but the intuitive understanding of what the data meant, the gentle nudge toward correct interpretation, vanished. He stood there for several minutes, waiting for the connection to restore. Around him, Ithari began to move differently. Their usual fluid coordination degraded into hesitant, jerky motions. One collapsed against a wall, thorax plates heaving. Another made a sound, a high-pitched keening that Kai had never heard from Ithari before. The interface had made vocalization obsolete. Whatever was happening, it was stripping away more than communication. The station-wide alert came through primitive audio systems that hadn't been used in decades. A synthetic voice, flat and crackling, instructed all personnel to return to designated quarters immediately. Kai walked through corridors that had become unfamiliar in their silence. Ithari pressed themselves against walls when they saw him, or each other, their eye membranes flickering in patterns he couldn't decode. In his quarters, he waited. The text-based emergency channel, backup technology maintained out of bureaucratic inertia, began filling with messages. Interface failure, widespread neurological symptoms, isolation protocols in effect. Humans were instructed to remain available for essential coordination tasks. Details would follow. The details came slowly, assembled from fragmented reports and observations. Eye contact between Ithari triggered some kind of feedback loop in their damaged neural interface systems. Proximity made it worse. Communities across 17 star systems were fracturing into solitude, and humans with their shallow, incompatible interfaces could somehow look at Ithari without causing harm. Kai read the reports 3 times, absorbing the implications. The thing that had made him marginal, his species' incomplete integration into collective technology, had become essential. He felt nothing in particular about this reversal. It was data, a change in parameters. He would adapt. The protocols developed through trial and necessity. A senior Ithari administrator, identified through text as Varesh, sector coordinator, sent Kai detailed instructions. He was to position himself at specific junction points between sectors. Ithari who needed to communicate would approach from opposite directions, maintaining prescribed distances. Kai would observe each party, memorize physical indicators, relay information between them. The first attempt was clumsy. 2 Ithari engineers needed to coordinate repairs to the water reclamation system in Sector 4. Kai stood in the corridor intersection as instructed, feeling absurdly exposed under the harsh utility lighting. The first engineer approached, stopped 10 meters away. An Ithari of the Narration subspecies, taller than human standard, with facial chromatophores that shifted through blue-green spectrums and 4 sensory tendrils that extended from where ears might be on a human. Kai looked at the engineer, trying to understand what he was supposed to observe. The chromatophores were doing something, changing color in patterns. The tendrils moved in ways that seemed deliberate rather than random. The engineer's thorax plates, visible through the mesh of their work uniform, compressed and expanded in a rhythm that didn't match respiration. He turned to face the other engineer, approaching from the opposite direction. A different subspecies, shorter, stockier, with rigid facial plates instead of chromatophores and gill slits that opened and closed along their neck. This one's tendrils were shorter, thicker, and they moved differently. The thorax plates had a different configuration entirely. Kai stood between them, paralyzed by incomprehension. The engineers waited. He could feel their attention on him, could sense some expectation he couldn't meet. After several minutes, both retreated. The mission was a failure. He returned to his quarters, feeling the unfamiliar weight of inadequacy. Varesh sent new instructions, observation training protocols. For the next 3 cycles, Kai was to spend 4 hours observing archived footage of Ithari interactions, cross-referenced with interface translation logs from before the collapse. He was to learn their body language the way one might learn a spoken tongue, through pattern recognition and repetition. He watched hundreds of hours, learned that chromatophore color shifts correlated with emotional states, blues for calm, greens for uncertainty, reds for urgency or distress. Learned that tendril angles could indicate direction, emphasis or question versus statement. Learned that thorax plate compression patterns served as prosody, adding meaning to the physical signals the same way vocal tone modified spoken words. The information accumulated in his mind like any technical skill. He created mental frameworks, categorization systems, decision trees for interpretation. When he returned to corridor duty, he could identify basic communication intent. An engineer indicating structural damage location, a physician requesting assistance, a logistics coordinator confirming resource allocation. It wasn't perfect. He missed nuances, misread combinations of signals, sometimes stood frozen trying to pass conflicting indicators. But the Ithari adapted. They simplified their signals, exaggerated key markers, developed a kind of pigeon body language that bridged the gap between their complexity and his limited interpretation. After 2 weeks, Kai was spending 10 hours per cycle in the corridors. Other humans had been assigned similar duties across different sectors. The station's basic functions continued: life support, food synthesis, minimal maintenance. But the texture of existence had changed. Where before the collective had operated as a nearly unified consciousness, now every interaction required deliberate, exhausting translation. Kai felt it in his body first. His back ached from standing motionless for hours. His eyes burned from the concentration required to track minute details in alien physiology. His sleep degraded. 6 hours became 4, became 3 interrupted stretches filled with dreams of endless corridors and watching eyes. He ate protein bars without tasting them, drank water without registering thirst, existed in a state of functional depletion that felt almost normal. The routine settled into his bones the way isolation had before. Wake, stand in corridors, observe, relay, return to quarters, sleep, repeat. The humans he'd avoided before tried to organize meetings, support groups, shared meals. He attended one, sat through 30 minutes of people discussing their feelings about the situation, their stress, their need for connection. Someone asked him how he was coping. He said, "Fine," and they looked at him with something between concern and suspicion. He stopped attending. Let them have their processing and their community. He had work that needed doing. The touching started in the 3rd week. Kai received a message from a medical supervisor requesting his presence in the Sector 7 health facility. A Ithari physician needed to conduct a physical examination of another Ithari physician who was showing signs of infection. Direct proximity between them risked triggering neural cascade. They needed an intermediary. Kai arrived at the facility, a space that had once been organized around interface-guided diagnostics and now looked half abandoned, equipment idle, surfaces dusty. Two Ithari waited in separate rooms. The medical supervisor, through text communication, explained the procedure. The examining physician would guide Kai's hands to specific examination points on their own body. Kai would then replicate those positions on the patient. He stood in the examination room, uncertain of the mechanics. The first physician entered, a Kethrin subspecies with smooth, almost amphibian skin texture and large, multifaceted eyes. They approached slowly, stopped at arm's length and extended a hand. 3 fingers, cool to the touch, slightly damp. They guided Kai's hand to their own neck, pressing his fingers against a specific point where he could feel a strong, rapid pulse beneath the skin. The physician's hand trembled slightly. Kai noticed this, catalogued it as data, fear probably, or the physical strain of proximity to another being when such proximity had become dangerous. The physician moved Kai's hand to another location, the ridge where thorax met abdomen, a place where Kai could feel the shift and movement of internal structures he didn't have names for. Then the physician released him, stepped back, gestured toward the other room where the patient waited. Kai entered, found an Ithari who looked visibly ill, chromatophores a sickly grey-yellow, tendrils hanging limp, breathing shallow and irregular. He approached, placed his hand at the same neck position he'd been shown. The skin was hot, the pulse erratic. He moved to the thorax ridge, felt swelling, inflammation, the heat of fever concentrated beneath chitinous plating. He returned to the first room, described what he'd felt. The physician's chromatophores shifted to worried green, tendrils coiling inward in what Kai had learned to recognize as distress. More instructions followed, more positions to examine. Kai became a diagnostic instrument, his hands the only safe medium for gathering the information needed for treatment. The procedure took an hour. When it was finished, Kai's hands smelled of alien skin, a scent both sweet and chemical, like overripe fruit mixed with antiseptic. He washed them in his quarters afterward, watched the water run over his palms, felt the phantom sensation of heat and pulse and trembling that wouldn't rinse away. More requests came. Not just medical examinations, but other situations where physical proximity was necessary. Equipment repairs that required coordination between 2 Ithari in tight spaces. Resource distribution that needed hands-on verification. Each time, Kai's body became the intermediary, standing between, reaching where they couldn't reach, touching where they couldn't touch. He began to understand the weight of being observed in a new way. The Ithari looked at him not with desire or affection, or even really recognition of him as a person. They looked at him as solution, as the only functional bridge between themselves and the world they needed to interact with. Their attention felt heavy, desperate, consuming, like being needed in a way that erased everything except the need itself. In the corridors, Ithari would sometimes stop when they saw him approaching. Not to avoid him, they'd learned humans were safe to perceive, but to look, just to look. Making eye contact with another being, even an alien one, after weeks of isolation. Kai would feel their eyes on him and understand that he was, in those moments, the only face in their universe that didn't threaten to break them. The other humans on the station were beginning to show strain. One, a woman named Sarah who worked in the agricultural sectors, had requested emergency transfer off-station. She'd filed reports of psychological distress, inability to cope with the constant demands, the weight of being essential. Another human, Marcus, had stopped responding to coordination requests entirely, locked himself in his quarters, and refused all contact. Kai read these reports with detached interest. He didn't feel what they apparently felt. The work was demanding, certainly, exhausting, but it was also clear, purposeful, necessary. He understood his function and could perform it. Wasn't that enough? His supervisor from before the collapse, a human administrative coordinator named Chen who'd barely spoken to him in the 3 years prior, sent him a message requesting a welfare check conversation. Kai responded with his status: operational, meeting all assigned duties, no issues to report. Chen pressed, "How are you really doing?" Kai stared at the question for several minutes before typing, "I'm fine." The response that came back felt worried, but Chen didn't push further. The bonded pair started requesting him in the 4th week. Kai received his first such summons through the text system. A request from 2 Ithari, identified as life-bonded partners of 43 years, for what they termed proximity facilitation. The message included a formal acknowledgement of the intimate nature of the request and assurance of appropriate compensation. Kai accepted without fully understanding what was being asked. He arrived at the designated quarters, larger than his own, decorated with objects he assumed held personal meaning. Wall hangings in geometric patterns, containers of what might be keepsakes, or might be functional items he couldn't identify. The space smelled different from corridors, lived in, layered with scents he was learning to distinguish as individual rather than species standard. The 2 Ithari were already there, positioned at opposite ends of the room. One was Narration, the tall chromatophore-bearing subspecies. The other was Catherine, shorter, with the smooth amphibian skin. They'd been together long enough that Kai could see complementary patterns in how they held themselves, an unconscious mirroring that spoke of decades of intimacy. They gestured for him to position himself in the center of the room. He stood there waiting for instructions that came through text rather than gesture. He was to remain still. They would approach and position themselves on either side of him. They would not touch each other. They would touch near him, using his presence as proxy for the proximity they could no longer safely share. The Narration approached first, moving slowly, stopping when they were close enough that Kai could feel the warmth radiating from their body. The Ithari leaned forward slightly, bringing their face near Kai's shoulder but not touching. Kai could feel breath against his neck, humid, carrying that sweet carbohydrate scent he'd learned to associate with Narration respiration. The Catherine approached from the other side, mirroring the position. Their breath was cooler, sharper, almost astringent. They were shorter, so their head came to Kai's shoulder blade. Both Ithari stood there, not moving, just maintaining proximity. Kai felt the heat of 2 bodies, the rhythm of 2 different respiratory patterns, the tremor of restraint in how carefully they held themselves. Then the Narration extended a hand, placed it on Kai's shoulder. The Catherine did the same from the opposite side. Their hands didn't meet, couldn't meet, but they were closer than they'd been in weeks. Kai could feel the trembling in both touches, the careful pressure, the way fingers flexed slightly as if fighting the urge to reach further. They stood that way for 20 minutes. Kai measured time by his own heartbeat, by the slow ache developing in his legs from standing motionless, by the heat accumulating where hands pressed against his shoulders. He didn't speak. Neither did they. The room was silent except for breathing, his and theirs, 3 different rhythms that didn't synchronize. When they finally stepped back, their chromatophores and skin tone had shifted to colors Kai had learned to read as relief, as something almost like contentment. They sent text thanks, formal and effusive. Kai left without responding, walked back to his quarters through corridors that felt colder than before. More requests came. Different bonded pairs, different configurations. Sometimes they wanted him to sit between them. Sometimes to stand while they positioned themselves at careful angles, using his body as reference point, as the only safe object of mutual attention. Once, a pair requested he extend his arms so they could each hold a hand, maintaining that single point of contact while standing as far apart as the reach would allow. Kai learned to recognize the particular quality of need in these encounters. It was different from the medical examinations or the coordination tasks. This was about connection rather than function, about maintaining some thread of intimacy across a void that had opened in their lives. He was the thread, anonymous, replaceable, essential. He began to notice his own responses. The weight of attention during these sessions felt different than in the corridors, more intense, more intimate despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that it wasn't about him at all. He was being used as tool, as proxy, as the closest approximation to touch that these beings could endure. And somewhere in his chest, in a place he usually kept carefully neutral, something responded to being needed this way. Not desire, exactly, not pleasure, but a kind of recognition, a sense that his presence mattered, that his body served a purpose beyond mechanical function. The Ithari who came to him for proximity facilitation treated him with a careful reverence that felt both uncomfortable and oddly compelling. They never took more than he offered, never pushed boundaries, but they needed him in ways that made him aware of his own physical existence, The warmth of his skin, the steadiness of his breathing, the solidity of his presence in space. After one particularly long session, 2 hours standing between a bonded triad, their hands resting on various points of his arms and shoulders, Kai returned to his quarters and found himself looking at his own reflection. He'd lost weight. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his hair needed cutting, but there was something else too, something in the set of his shoulders or the way he held his face. Like he was becoming a different version of himself, and hadn't noticed the transformation until it was already underway. He looked away from the mirror, ate a protein bar without tasting it, and slept 4 hours filled with dreams of being touched by hands that weren't quite hands, of breathing in rhythms that weren't quite his own. Kai received an unusual request in his 5th week on corridor duty. A young Ithari, identifier senior agricultural technician, had isolated herself in the hydroponics sector and wasn't responding to coordination requests. Food production was continuing on automated systems, but manual oversight was needed for several critical functions. Medical staff couldn't approach her without risking neural cascade. They needed an intermediary to make contact. He found her in the deep section of hydroponics, surrounded by vertical growing arrays that stretched 3 stories high. The air was thick, humid, smelling of earth and green growth and the particular sweetness of flowering plants. Water trickled through irrigation channels, creating a constant background whisper that made the space feel alive in ways the rest of the station wasn't. Sina sat on the floor beside one of the irrigation channels, knees drawn up, tendrils hanging limp. She looked up when Kai entered, and he saw immediately that she was young. Maturity markers barely visible on her facial ridges, chromatophores still displaying the slightly brighter tones of adolescence. Her eyes were large, multifaceted, reflecting light in ways that made expression hard to read. But something in the angle of her body, the stillness, spoke of anguish. Kai approached slowly, stopped at what had become standard distance, gestured a greeting he'd learned. Sina didn't respond through gesture. Instead, she did something unexpected. She spoke. The voice was rough, unpracticed, words in standard common tongue that she must have learned but rarely used before the interface made language obsolete. "Alone," she said. Just that one word, pronunciation awkward but meaning clear. Kai nodded, considered his options, stood there in the humidity and green smell while water whispered, and Sina watched him with those large, fractured light eyes. Then he did something he hadn't done before in any of these encounters. He sat down, not at prescribed distance, not following protocol. He sat across from her, maybe 2 meters away, close enough to see the subtle shifts in her chromatophores, the way her tendrils moved slightly with each breath, close enough to be present in a way that felt different from standing in corridors, being observed, serving as tool or bridge. Sina's chromatophores shifted toward surprised green. She looked at him, and for the first time since the collapse, Kai felt like he was being seen, rather than just used as functional object. They sat that way in silence. Minutes accumulated. The plants grew around them with imperceptible patience. Water continued its endless circulation. Eventually Sina moved, extended one hand slowly, hesitantly, waiting. Kai recognized the gesture from proximity facilitation sessions, permission being requested. He nodded. She shifted closer, not touching distance yet, but near enough that he could feel the warmth of her body in the humid air, could smell the particular scent that clung to her after hours in the hydroponics sector, like crushed leaves and mineral-rich water. She placed her hand on his forearm. The touch was light, tentative, her 3 fingers barely making contact. Her skin was cool despite the warmth of the air, smooth, slightly damp. She didn't move further, just maintained that single point of connection while they sat in the whispering green space. Kai felt something shift in his chest, not the careful neutrality he'd maintained through all the other sessions, something warmer, an awareness that this wasn't about protocols or necessity, or even really about loneliness. Sina was young, possibly had never known isolation before, had grown up in a civilization where connection was constant and seamless. And now she was alone in ways her species had never evolved to endure. He didn't pull away, let her maintain the contact as long as she needed. They sat for hours. At some point, Sina's head lowered, came to rest against his shoulder, not quite touching, hovering just close enough that he could feel each breath, each slight movement. Her tendrils relaxed, stopped the anxious curling that indicated distress. The green of her chromatophores deepened toward something calmer. When Kai finally needed to leave, other duties waiting, his own exhaustion reaching critical levels, Sena released him slowly. Her eyes met his, and he saw gratitude there, and something else. Recognition, maybe. The sense that he'd offered something beyond mere function. He returned the next cycle, and the next, not because protocols required it, but because Sena responded to text messages requesting his presence, and he found himself unable to refuse. They developed a routine. He would arrive at the hydroponics sector, navigate through the green growing spaces, find her in the same location beside the irrigation channels. They would sit together. Sometimes she would touch his arm or hand. Sometimes she would just be near him, close enough for presence to matter. She began to speak more, fragments of common tongue, awkward and halting, but improving with practice. She told him about before, about the interface, how it had felt to exist in constant connection with thousands of minds, to never truly be alone, about after, the silence that wasn't really silence but worse, the awareness of others without the ability to reach them, like being sealed in transparent walls. Kai listened. He wasn't good at this, at receiving emotional information, at knowing what response was expected, but he could be present. Could sit in the humidity and green smell while Sena spoke, could let her hand rest on his forearm, could offer the simple fact of his attention. The change happened gradually enough that Kai didn't notice it arriving. Somewhere between the 6th and 7th week, the nature of his interactions began to shift. The Athari he worked with regularly started to develop individual identities in his mind. Varesh, the sector coordinator, who always positioned their tendrils at precise right angles when conveying instructions. Keth, one of the medical staff, whose chromatophores flickered rapidly when anxious. The bonded pair in Sector 3, who held his hands with a gentle pressure that felt almost reverent. And Sena, always Sena, in the hydroponics sector, speaking in fragmented common tongue that grew more fluent each day. She asked him questions. Where was he from on Earth? A city he barely remembered. Parents he hadn't contacted in 7 years. Did he have bonded partners? No. Did he experience loneliness? He'd said no automatically, then reconsidered, said, I don't know. Sena's tendrils had curled inward at that answer, chromatophores shifting to contemplative blue-green. Before interface, she said slowly, I never separate, always connected. Always together, mind. She touched her head where the interface node would be, under the smooth ridge of her skull. Now separated. First time knowing this. She didn't have a word. Gestured at the space around her, the isolation. Kai understood. He'd spent most of his life isolated by choice or inability, but he'd been formed for it. Humans were individuals first, occasionally connecting through effort and intention. The Athari had been collective consciousness first, and Sena's entire neurology had been shaped by connections she could no longer access. Does it hurt? He asked. The question emerged without planning, direct in a way he usually avoided. Sena's chromatophores went dark grey, almost black. Yes, different than body hurt, like, she struggled with vocabulary, like being cut but no blood, like essential part missing but still alive without it. They sat in silence after that. Kai became aware of his own breathing, the way it sounded loud in the space between them. Became aware of Sena's breathing too, faster than his, shallower. Her hand on his forearm, the 3 fingers that had stopped feeling alien and had become simply familiar. He made a decision without fully examining it, shifted his position slightly, turned his hand over so his palm faced up. An invitation. Sena's tendrils quivered. She adjusted her grip, placed her palm against his. Her hand was smaller, cooler, the texture of her skin different from human skin but not unpleasant. He closed his fingers gently, holding her hand the way humans did, and felt her entire body respond. Tendrils extending, chromatophores brightening toward surprised green, thorax plates expanding as her breathing deepened. This, she said quietly, this is good. Kai nodded. It was good. The simple contact, freely given, carrying meaning beyond function. He held her hand, and felt something in his chest that he'd been denying for weeks. Not just acceptance of being used, but actual desire to provide comfort. To be present, not because protocols required it, but because Sina needed him, and he could meet that need. They stayed that way until his next scheduled duty cycle began. When he left, Sina's chromatophores were the brightest he'd seen them, almost luminescent in the diffuse grow light of the hydroponics sector. The shift affected his other interactions too. Kai found himself paying different kinds of attention to the Ithari he encountered, not just cataloging signals for accurate relay, but noticing individual quirks, recognizing patterns that spoke to personality rather than just physiological state. Varesh always approached with a particular gait, tendrils held at that precise angle, even when urgency might warrant less formality. Keth's chromatophores displayed a baseline anxiety that never fully resolved, suggesting someone who'd always been nervous even before the collapse. The bonded pairs he assisted with proximity facilitation started to feel less like anonymous protocols and more like individuals whose pain he could recognize. A Kethrin couple who always held his hands identically, perfect mirror movements speaking to decades of synchronized life. A mixed-species triad whose different physical configurations meant they couldn't all touch him simultaneously, creating a rotation where one always had to wait their turn, patience and longing visible in every line of their bodies. He began to understand what the collapse had taken from them. Not just communication efficiency or social coordination, but intimacy. The bone-deep knowledge of being understood, of existing in perfect comprehension with others of your kind. They'd lost that, and he, accidentally through evolutionary happenstance, had become one of the few bridges back toward anything resembling connection. The weight of it was different now. Not lighter exactly, but textured in new ways. He felt responsible not just for preventing systems failure, but for honoring the trust these beings placed in him. When Ithari came to him for proximity facilitation, when they leaned close and let their breath touch his skin and placed trembling hands on his shoulders, they were being vulnerable in ways they'd never had to be before. And Kai, who'd spent his life avoiding vulnerability, found himself wanting to protect theirs. Chen, his human supervisor, sent another welfare check message. This time Kai's response was longer. He wrote about the work, not just the mechanics, but the meaning. About Sina in the hydroponics sector, about the bonded pairs and their careful rituals of almost touching, about how exhausting it was and how necessary it felt. Chen's response came back worried. You need to maintain boundaries. You can't carry all of this yourself. Don't forget you're human. Kai read the message several times. The last line stuck. Don't forget you're human. As if being human was something separate from what he was doing, from who he was becoming in these endless corridors and growing spaces. As if the essential part of humanity was maintaining distance rather than closing it. He didn't respond, went to his next duty station, stood in the corridor while Ithari communicated through his observation and presence, felt their need like a physical weight, and carried it because no one else could. The 8th week brought the first crisis that wasn't technical or logistical, but purely human. Marcus, one of the other human intermediaries, suffered a complete psychological breakdown. Kai learned about it through emergency text alerts. Marcus had destroyed equipment in his quarters, injured himself badly enough to require medical intervention, and was being sedated and prepared for emergency evacuation. The station was down to 19 humans, 18 now that Marcus was incapacitated. The remaining humans received updated duty rosters, longer hours, more sectors, less rest time between shifts. Kai's schedule went from 12 hours to 16, with shortened sleep cycles to accommodate the increased demand. He felt it immediately. His body, already depleted, pushed into territories of exhaustion that compromised function. He began making mistakes, misreading chromatophore signals, confusing similar tendril positions, occasionally losing track of which Ithari had sent which message. Small errors, but in a system where his accuracy was the only thing preventing complete breakdown, even small errors had cascading effects. A water reclamation coordinator missed critical maintenance because Kai had transposed 2 different sets of instructions. The system nearly failed before backup automation caught the oversight. A medical emergency was delayed by precious minutes because Kai couldn't pass urgent distress signals from routine discomfort. The patient survived, but the margin had been too narrow. Kai stood in his quarters after 18 straight hours on duty, hands shaking from fatigue, and felt the first real edge of panic he'd experienced since the collapse. He couldn't sustain this. His body was failing. His mind was failing. And there was no backup, no replacement, no option to step away. Sina found him in that state. She'd learned to send text messages, had developed a habit of checking on him between her agricultural duties. Her message came through while he was staring at his hands, watching them tremble. "Are you in quarters? May I come?" He almost said no, almost sent back that he was fine, that she should focus on her own work, that he needed to sleep. Instead, he typed, "Yes." She arrived within minutes, must have run from the hydroponics sector. When she entered his quarters, the first time any Ithari had been inside his personal space, her chromatophores were vibrant with concern, tendrils moving in agitated patterns. She looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her cross the distance between them without hesitation. Sina knelt in front of where he sat on the edge of his sleeping platform, placed both hands on his knees, looked up at him with those fractured light eyes. "You are breaking," she said. Her common tongue had improved but was still direct, missing the softening phrases humans used. "Like me, like all of us. But you try to not break. Try to be," she struggled for the word, "unbreakable. Cannot be. Will break worse." Kai's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. Sena's hands moved from his knees to his hands, took his trembling fingers in her cooler, steadier grip. "Let break," she said. "I am here. You can be not alone?" Something in his chest came apart. Not dramatically, not with tears or obvious emotion, but with a quiet dissolution of the careful control he'd maintained for weeks, months, years maybe. He lowered his head, felt Sina's forehead, cooler than human, textured differently, rest against his shoulder. She held his hands and he let himself be held, let himself stop performing functional competence for just these few minutes. "I'm so tired," he said. The words felt like confession. Sena's grip tightened. "I know. I see. Every day I see you walking corridors, standing for hours, never stopping, like you are machine, not living being." Her tendrils brushed against his wrists, a gesture he'd learned meant comfort, reassurance. "But you are alive. You need rest, need care." "Is correct word?" Kai nodded against her shoulder. Care. Such a simple concept, such a foreign one in his actual experience. He'd been competent, functional, useful, but cared for. That implied vulnerability he'd never permitted himself. They stayed that way until Kai's trembling subsided, until his breathing deepened toward something approaching calm. When Sina finally pulled back, her chromatophores had shifted to softer colors, and there was something in her expression, a configuration of features he was learning to read, that looked like tenderness. "Come," she said. "I show you something." She led him to the hydroponics sector, to a section he hadn't explored before. Here the growing arrays were smaller, more varied, containing plants from multiple worlds. Sina navigated to a particular platform where something was flowering, small delicate blooms in colors that didn't exist in Earth's natural palette, blues that shifted toward ultraviolet, reds that contained depths his eyes could barely process. "My section," Sina said. "My project before silence. Growing plants that should not survive together, different world origins, different needs. But I make them survive. Make space where they can exist together." She touched one of the blooms gently. "You are like this. Human among Ithari. Should not work, but you make it work. Make space where we can exist together." Kai looked at the impossible garden she'd created. The integration of incompatible life, sustained through careful attention and adaptation. "It's beautiful," he said. Sina's chromatophores went bright with pleasure. "Yes, and you are," she hesitated over the words, "important to me. Not just because you are Bridge, because you are you." The statement landed in Kai's chest with unexpected weight. Important, not for function, but for self. He turned to look at Sena, saw her watching him with an attention that was different from the desperate need of bonded pairs, different from the clinical observation of medical staff. This was personal, specific, chosen. "You're important to me too," he said, meaning it. Feeling it as truth he hadn't examined, but that existed regardless of examination. Sina moved closer, placed her hand over his heart, feeling the rhythm there. Her own cardiovascular system was different, pulse distributed through multiple smaller organs rather than one central pump, but the gesture's meaning was clear. "Your heart beats fast," she said. "Yes." He didn't move away. Let her feel what his body was doing. The acceleration that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with proximity, with touch, with the particular quality of attention she was giving him. "Mine also," Sina said, took his hand, guided it to her thorax where he could feel the complex pattern of her distributed cardiovascular response, rapid and strong. "When you are near, when I think about you." Strange feeling. Good strange. Kai's fingers spread slightly against her thorax, feeling the intricate machinery of her alien physiology, so different from human structure, yet performing the same essential functions, keeping her alive, responding to stimulus and emotion, accelerating now in response to his touch, just as his accelerated to hers. "Sina," he said. Not a question, not a statement, just her name, an acknowledgement of her presence, and his awareness of it. She leaned closer. He could feel her breath, warm now, faster against his neck. Could smell the green-growing scent that clung to her, mixed with her own particular pheromone signature. Her free hand came up, tentatively touched his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw with extreme care. "May I?" She started, then stopped. Tried again in her own language, sounds that Kai had no framework for translating. Tried once more in common tongue. "May I be close? More close?" Kai nodded. Couldn't speak. Sina shifted position, moving from standing in front of him to sitting beside him on the platform edge, close enough that their bodies touched along shoulder and hip and thigh. She rested her head against his shoulder, and he felt the full weight of her against him, the warmth and solidity and aliveness of her presence. They sat that way, surrounded by the impossible garden, by growing things that shouldn't coexist but did, and Kai understood that he was crossing some threshold he couldn't uncross. Sina wasn't protocol or duty or professional function. She was person, specific and irreplaceable, and what he felt in her presence was something he'd successfully avoided his entire life. Connection. Actual, chosen, reciprocal connection that had nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with recognition. "Stay," Sina said quietly. "Tonight. Don't go back to quarters. Stay here with me." Kai knew he should refuse, should maintain boundaries, preserve professional distance, remember that he was intermediary, not participant, should follow Chen's advice and not forget he was human. "Okay," he said instead. "I'll stay." Kai woke in the hydroponics sector, surrounded by the whisper of water and the green-growing smell that had become synonymous with Sina's presence. He'd slept on a makeshift platform she'd assembled from agricultural materials, and she'd stayed beside him through the full sleep cycle, her body a warm presence against his side. Morning brought clarity that made the previous night feel both inevitable and impossible. He'd crossed boundaries that the entire institutional structure around him assumed would remain intact. Humans were intermediaries, tools for Ithari survival, not participants in Ithari lives, and certainly not whatever he'd become with Sina. She stirred when he did, her chromatophores shifting from sleep-dark to waking colors, tendrils unfurling slowly. When she looked at him, her expression was content in ways he'd never seen before. Happy, maybe, if that translation was accurate. "Good morning," she said, the phrase clearly practiced, pronunciation careful. "Good morning." His voice was rough from sleep. He sat up, became aware of his body's various complaints, stiffness from the improvised bed, persistent exhaustion that one night's sleep hadn't resolved, but also something else. A lack of the pervasive tension he'd carried for weeks. Some knot in his chest had loosened. Sina sat up too, moved close enough that their shoulders touched. "You slept well. I could tell by breathing. You watched me sleep. Is wrong?" She looked worried, tendrils curling inward. "No, just..." He didn't have a framework for this, for someone caring enough to monitor his breathing, to stay close through vulnerability, to be present simply for the sake of presence. "Thank you." Her chromatophores brightened. She reached for his hand, and the gesture was becoming familiar now, natural in a way that should have alarmed him, but didn't. Must go to duty soon. Kai checked his internal chronometer, felt his stomach sink. He was already late for his first corridor shift. Messages were probably accumulating in the text system, Ithari waiting for intermediary presence that he'd failed to provide. He stood quickly, Sena's hand slipping from his. "I have to go, I'm sorry." Sena stood too. "Will I see you? Today?" The question was simple but carried weight. She wasn't asking about protocols or scheduled duties. She was asking if he would choose to return, to continue whatever they'd begun. Kai looked at her, at the way she held her body with hope and uncertainty, at the brightening chromatophores that spoke to emotional investment he hadn't earned, but somehow had anyway. "Yes," he said. "Tonight, if I can." He left before he could reconsider, navigated back through the station to his quarters. The text system was indeed full of messages. Irritated queries from Varesh about missed coordination windows. Medical staff requesting his presence for examinations he hadn't appeared for. A concerned message from Chen. "Where are you? Report status." Kai sent rapid responses, rearranged his schedule to compensate for the missed hours, and reported to his first corridor station 40 minutes late. The Ithari, who'd been waiting, 2 engineers needing to coordinate on structural repairs, showed visible distress signals. Their tendrils quivered, chromatophores dark with anxiety. Kai positioned himself and performed his function, but he felt their fear underneath it. Fear that the human intermediaries were failing, that the fragile system keeping their civilization functional was breaking down. The day was brutal. Extended hours trying to compensate for the delay, message after message requesting his presence. Ithari who needed proximity facilitation or medical examination or simple observation to feel less isolated. Kai moved through the routines mechanically, feeling the return of exhaustion that had briefly lifted, feeling the weight of being essential settle back onto his shoulders like physical mass. During a brief gap between duties, he received a message from Chen requesting immediate meeting. Kai almost ignored it, but the phrasing suggested it wasn't optional. He reported to the human administrative sector, found Chen waiting in a small conference room. Chen looked tired. All the humans looked tired now, but Chen carried additional weight as the person trying to coordinate their impossible workload. They gestured for Kai to sit, didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You were in the hydroponics sector last night." "Not a question." Kai nodded. "With the Ithari agricultural technician, Sena." Another nod. Chen's expression was complicated, not quite disapproving, not quite concerned, something in between. "Kai, I'm going to be direct. Are you developing a personal relationship with her?" The question felt like accusation. Kai's first instinct was to deny, to retreat into professional distance. But he was too tired for pretense. "Yes, that's problematic. You understand that, right? Our role here is specifically defined as intermediaries. We're not supposed to become emotionally entangled with the Ithari. The power dynamic alone, they need us to survive. They can't give meaningful consent to relationships when they're this dependent." Kai had thought about this, circled around it in the hours he'd spent with Sena. "She initiated contact. I didn't pursue her. And I think she's capable of knowing what she wants." "Maybe. But you're capable of knowing what you should refuse." Chen leaned forward. "Look, I'm not trying to be cruel. I understand the isolation, the intensity of what we're all experiencing. But you need to maintain boundaries. For your own well-being and for hers, this can't go anywhere good." "Why not?" The question seemed to catch Chen off guard. "What? Why can't it go anywhere good? The collapse isn't temporary. The Ithari civilization isn't recovering. This is their reality now and our reality. If something meaningful develops in that context, why is that automatically wrong?" Chen was quiet for a long moment. "Because you're human, and she's not. Because the fundamental power imbalance can't be resolved as long as they need us to survive. Because if Earth sends support or evacuation, you'll leave and she'll be here. And what happens to her then?" Kai didn't have answers. Just the memory of Sena's hand in his, her head resting against his shoulder, the way her chromatophores brightened when she looked at him. Feelings that existed regardless of whether they should. "I'll be careful," he said finally. Chen looked skeptical, but didn't push. "Your duty schedule is unsustainable. We're trying to get authorization for more humans to transfer in, but that takes time. In the meanwhile, try to get actual rest. You're no good to anyone if you collapse. Kai left the meeting feeling worse than when he'd entered. Chen was right about the power dynamics, right about the unsustainability, right about all the practical objections to what he was allowing to develop with Sena. But knowing something intellectually didn't change what he felt, didn't make him want to stop seeing her, didn't reduce the pull he experienced toward the hydroponics sector where she waited. He completed his remaining duties for the cycle, then made a choice that felt both right and wrong simultaneously. Instead of returning to his quarters to sleep, he went to find Sena. She was in her garden section, tending the impossible flowers that shouldn't bloom together but did. When she saw him, her entire body responded, chromatophores luminous, tendrils extending in welcome, thorax expanding as her breathing deepened. She crossed the distance between them without hesitation, and Kai caught her, felt her weight against him, felt the rightness of her presence, even as his mind catalogued all the reasons this was complicated. "You came," she said, voice muffled against his shoulder. "I came." They stood that way, holding each other in the growing space, while the water whispered and the plants grew and the station hummed its mechanical rhythms around them. Kai felt the future closing in, the impossibility of what they were building, the inevitable complications, the hurt that was probably coming for both of them. But in this moment, with Sena's warmth against him and her heartbeat pattern strong beneath his hand, he couldn't bring himself to care about futures or consequences, or the careful logic that said this was a mistake. The 9th and 10th weeks blurred together in a rhythm that was both unsustainable and somehow sustaining. Kai's days were split between corridor duty, endless hours serving as intermediary observation point, bridge between isolated Ithari, and stolen time with Sena in the hydroponics sector. He was sleeping 4 hours per cycle on average, eating irregularly, existing in a state of depletion that should have broken him. But Sena became something like relief. The time with her was the only period where he wasn't performing function, wasn't being used as tool or observed as solution. She looked at him and saw person, specific and individual. She touched him because she wanted contact with him particularly, not because he was the only safe option for touch. The distinction mattered more than Kai had anticipated. They developed their own rituals. After his evening duties, Kai would come to the hydroponics sector. Sena would be waiting in the garden section, always, and the consistency of her presence felt like anchor in a reality that had become unmoored. They would sit together among the impossible flowers, her hand in his, and talk. Sena's common tongue improved rapidly. She was learning from him, adapting to human speech patterns with the same facility she'd shown in making incompatible plants grow together. Their conversations ranged across topics Kai had never discussed with anyone: what it had been like to grow up in the collective's neural interface culture, the sensation of constant connection she'd lost, what it had been like to grow up human and isolated, the absence of connection he'd always carried. "I think we are opposites," Sena said one evening, her tendrils coiled around his fingers in a gesture he'd learned meant affection. "I had too much connection, you had too little. Now we both have this." She squeezed his hand. "Right amount?" Kai considered. The physical contact that had felt strange and overwhelming when the collapse first began now felt necessary, grounding. He realized he'd started to crave it, not touch in general, but Sena's touch specifically. The coolness of her skin, the three-fingered grip, the way she would lean against him and synchronize her breathing to his. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe we're both still learning what the right amount is." Sena's chromatophores shifted thoughtfully. "Learning together is good way." The intimacy escalated gradually. Not toward anything sexual. Their physiologies were too different. Their understanding of each other's bodies too incomplete for that kind of connection. But there was sensuality in the way Sena would trace the lines of his face, mapping human features with careful attention. In the way Kai would place his hand over her distributed cardiovascular system, feeling the complex rhythm that meant she was alive and present and responsive. In the moments when she would press close enough that he could feel every point of contact between their bodies, could feel her warmth through his clothes, could sense her breathing against his neck. They slept together most nights now. Sina had built a better platform in a secluded section of the hydroponics area, surrounded by the flowering plants and the constant whisper of water. Kai would arrive exhausted from corridor duty, and Sina would be waiting. They would lie down together, her body fitted against his in a configuration they'd learned through trial and adjustment, and he would sleep more deeply than he had since childhood. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the sleep cycle to find Sina watching him, her large eyes reflecting what little light filtered through the growing arrays. "Making sure you're still breathing well," she would say when caught. "Making sure you're safe." The word safe struck Kai each time. He'd never thought of himself as someone who needed to be kept safe, never imagined anyone would want to maintain that vigil. But Sena did, and it altered something fundamental in how he understood himself. He wasn't just functional, competent tool. He was person who someone cared enough about to watch over, to ensure well-being, to protect even in small ways. But the cost of the dual existence was mounting. Chen's warnings proved accurate. The emotional entanglement affected his work. He made more mistakes during corridor duty, missed subtle signals because his mind was partially elsewhere, thinking about Sina, wondering if she was okay, counting hours until he could return to her. The Athari began to notice. Varesh sent concerned messages about declining accuracy. Medical staff requested he take mandatory rest cycles he ignored. The other humans were deteriorating too. 2 more requested emergency evacuation. One, a woman named Jay who'd been on the station longer than Kai, simply stopped responding to duty assignments, had to be placed under medical supervision. The remaining 15 humans tried to absorb the workload, but the math was becoming impossible. A delegation of Ithari administrators sent a formal proposal. Increase human compensation significantly. Offer guaranteed passage to Earth when relief arrived. Provide access to collective technology that had previously been restricted. Anything to convince the remaining humans to stay, to maintain the intermediary functions that kept basic civilization operational. Kai read the proposal with detached interest. The offers were generous, unprecedented, but they didn't address the fundamental problem. There weren't enough humans to sustain the demand. Something would break eventually, the system or the people, possibly both. He was lying with Sina in their garden platform when he told her about the proposal. She was quiet for a long time, her tendrils moving in patterns that indicated deep thought. "They are desperate," she said finally. "My people, we are not," she struggled for the word, "adapted to this, to being separate. It breaks us in ways your people can survive, but we cannot." Kai turned to look at her. "Does it break you?" Sina's chromatophores went dark, complex. "Yes, every day. The silence where connection should be, the isolation. But," she touched his chest over his heart, "you make it bearable. When I am with you, the breaking feels less. Like you are..." Again the vocabulary search. "Glue, holding broken pieces together." The metaphor was clumsy, but the meaning clear. Kai understood it because he felt something similar, like Sina was holding pieces of him together that he hadn't known were fragmented. They were both broken by different mechanisms, finding temporary cohesion in proximity to each other. "What happens when I can't be glue anymore?" he asked. "When the work becomes too much or I have to leave?" Sina's grip tightened over his heart. "Don't think about that. Be here now, with me. That is enough." But it wasn't enough, and they both knew it. The future was coming, inevitable and problematic, and neither of them had solutions. They just had this, the hydroponics sector, the impossible garden, the temporary refuge they'd built in the hours between duties. Kai pulled her closer, felt her settle against him with a small sound of contentment. He knew Chen was right about the unsustainability, right about the power imbalances, right about the complications they were creating. But he also knew that when he held Sena like this, when her breathing synchronized with his and her chromatophores brightened with happiness, he felt more complete than he'd ever felt in his life. He was learning what connection meant. Learning it late, learning it in impossible circumstances with someone whose species he barely understood, but learning nonetheless. And the cost of that learning, the exhaustion, the professional complications, the inevitable hurt, felt worth paying. For now. In this moment, with Sena's warmth against him, and water whispering through the garden and the station humming its mechanical rhythms around their small refuge from isolation. The crisis arrived in the 11th week without warning. Kai was on corridor duty in Sector 5 when the medical emergency alert came through. An Ithari in the deep residential areas had collapsed, not from neural cascade or interface malfunction, but from something simpler and more final. Complete psychological breakdown, the text message said. Self-isolation had progressed to catatonia. Medical intervention required immediately. Kai abandoned his post, ran through corridors toward the residential sector. When he arrived, he found medical staff waiting outside the sealed quarters, unable to enter because direct contact with the patient would trigger cascade in both parties. They needed human intermediary to assess the situation, to determine if physical intervention was possible. The quarters were dark when Kai entered. An Ithari, older, their maturity ridges deeply pronounced, lay on the floor, unmoving. Chromatophores were fixed in a grey-black color that Kai had learned to associate with severe distress. Breathing was shallow, irregular. The Ithari's eyes were open, but didn't track his movement when he approached. Kai knelt beside them, checked for physical injury. Found none. This was purely psychological, the weight of isolation exceeding what this individual could sustain. He'd heard about cases like this in other sectors, Ithari who simply stopped. Unable to endure separation from the neural collective they'd been born into, choosing catatonia over continued consciousness in solitude. He stayed for 3 hours, trying to coax response. Spoke in common tongue, even though he knew the Ithari probably couldn't understand. Touched their shoulder, their hand, their face with careful gentleness. No response. The medical staff outside sent messages. Patient was dying. Not from physical cause, but from something that medical intervention couldn't address. The collapse was existential, and existence couldn't be imposed from outside. When Kai finally left the quarters, he felt something shift inside his chest. The Ithari died within the hour, despite every effort to sustain them. Medical staff logged it as system failure, but Kai knew better. It was a choice, conscious or not. Death by isolation. Death from being severed from connection that constituted identity. He went through the rest of his duty cycle in mechanical motion, performing functions without presence. When he finally made it to the hydroponics sector, Sina took one look at his face and pulled him into her arms without questions. "Someone died," he said against her shoulder, "because they couldn't handle being alone." Sina held him tighter. "I know this fear," she said quietly. "Every day, I know it. The silence where collective should be, like part of mind is missing, like essential self is gone." Kai pulled back to look at her. "How do you survive it?" Her chromatophores shifted through complicated colors. I survive because of you. Because when I am with you, I am not entirely alone. You are—" She touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "My connection now. My collective of one." The words should have felt romantic, affirming. Instead, they felt heavy, frightening. Kai understood what Sina was saying, that he'd become essential to her survival, that she was dependent on him in ways that exceeded choice or preference. And he realized, looking at her luminous chromatophores and the tenderness in how she touched him, that the dependency was mutual. He needed her presence as much as she needed his. They'd become each other's lifeline, and if either line broke, the consequences would be catastrophic. "That's too much pressure," he said. "I can't be your whole world. I can't carry that responsibility." Sina's expression shifted to something like hurt. "But you are. Already you are. I cannot make it different just because you want it different." They stood in the garden surrounded by impossible flowers, and the fragility of what they'd built became suddenly, painfully clear. Kai's exhaustion, the unsustainable workload, the mounting pressure of being essential to too many people, it was all coming to a point where something had to break. And Sina's isolation, her dependence on him as sole connection, her inability to endure separation from collective consciousness without his presence as substitute, that was breaking point too. "I need to step back," Kai said, hating the words even as he spoke them. "I need to maintain boundaries. For both of us." Sina's chromatophores went dark, tendrils coiling inward. "No, please, do not." She switched to her own language, sounds that were distress and pleading and fear. switched back to common tongue. I cannot survive without you. You are only thing keeping me not broken. Kai felt his chest compress. This was the power dynamic Chen had warned about. This was the impossibility of their situation made explicit. He couldn't leave without breaking her. But staying was breaking him. The mathematics of it were cruel and unsolvable. I'm not leaving, he said, even though part of him wanted to run from the weight of being needed this intensely. I need to find balance. I can't be with you every night. I can't let you depend on me for all your connection. It's not sustainable. But I love you. The words came out simple, direct, devastating. Seina's vocabulary had expanded enough to include the concept, and she used it now without hesitation. In my language, it is different word, but closest translation is love. I love you. Does that not matter? Kai's throat tightened. Did she love him? Or did she love the relief from isolation he represented? Could anyone distinguish between the two when need and affection were so thoroughly entangled? Could he? It matters, he said. But I don't know if it's enough. Seina's whole body seemed to collapse inward. Her chromatophores went the dark grey-black he'd seen on the dying Ithari earlier. She stepped away from him, and the distance felt like physical pain. Then go, she said. If you will leave eventually, go now. Do not make slow hurt. Just go. Kai stood there, torn between every instinct he had. He wanted to close the distance, pull her back, promise he'd stay forever. He wanted to run, protect himself from the inevitable complications and hurt. He wanted to find some middle path that didn't exist. I'll come back tomorrow, he said finally. We can talk when we're both calmer. Seina didn't respond, turned away from him, moved deeper into the garden section where the shadows were thickest. Kai waited for several minutes, hoping she'd turn back, but she didn't. He left feeling like he'd torn something essential, something that wouldn't heal cleanly no matter what choices he made next. Kai spent 3 days away from the hydroponics sector, 3 days of corridor duty performed with mechanical precision, sleeping in his own quarters, avoiding all personal contact. He told himself he was establishing boundaries, protecting both of them from unsustainable dependency. But mostly he felt hollow. The Ithari he worked with noticed the change. His accuracy had actually improved in some ways. Without the distraction of Seina, he could focus entirely on observation and relay. But something in his demeanor must have shifted because Varesh sent a concerned message. Are you functioning adequately? Your performance is acceptable, but your presence feels diminished. Diminished, yes, that was exactly the word. Like some essential part of him had been removed, leaving only the functional components operating at minimum capacity. Chen called a meeting of all remaining humans on the 4th day. 13 now. 2 more had been evacuated for psychological reasons. The survivors gathered in a conference room that felt too large for their reduced numbers. Earth is sending support, Chen announced without preamble. 20 additional humans, specialized training in Ithari communication, scheduled to arrive in approximately 6 weeks. In the meanwhile, we need to sustain current operations. I'm implementing mandatory rest protocols. Each of you will have enforced downtime, reduced duty hours, psychological support sessions. The other humans asked questions about the incoming support, about evacuation options, about long-term plans. Kai sat silently, trying to calculate 6 weeks. 6 weeks of this liminal existence. 6 weeks of avoiding Seina while knowing she was nearby, isolated, potentially fracturing the way that Ithari had fractured before dying. 6 weeks of being essential to people who needed him in ways he couldn't sustain. After the meeting, Chen pulled him aside. You ended things with Seina. Not a question. Kai nodded. How is she handling it? I don't know. I haven't seen her since. Chen's expression was complicated. The agricultural supervisors are reporting that she's stopped maintaining some of her duties. Not critical systems, but the specialty projects. Her garden section. The information felt like being struck. Seina's garden was everything to her. The impossible flowers, the integration of incompatible life, the physical manifestation of her ability to create connection where it shouldn't exist. If she was abandoning that, I need to check on her, Kai said. Is that wise? You established boundaries for a reason. She might be in crisis. I can't just ignore that. Chen sighed. Kai, you can't save everyone. You can barely save yourself. The incoming support will help, but in the meanwhile you need to prioritize your own stability. But Kai was already leaving, already moving through corridors toward the hydroponics sector with purpose that felt like inevitability. He found the garden section without difficulty. The route had become automatic over weeks of nightly visits. The space looked different immediately. The lighting was wrong. Some of the grow lamps had burned out and not been replaced. The irrigation system was running erratically, and the flowers, the impossible blooms that shouldn't exist together, were wilting. Sina was there, sitting in the same spot where they'd first made real contact beside the irrigation channel, but she looked diminished, exactly the word Varesh had used for Kai. Her chromatophores were dull, tendrils hanging limp, thorax plates compressed in patterns that spoke to distress. She looked up when he approached, and something in her eyes, hurt, hope, fear, all mixed together, made Kai's chest compress. "Your garden is dying," he said, because he didn't know how to start with the things that actually mattered. "I know." Her voice was quiet, flatter than he'd heard before. "Cannot make myself care about keeping alive things that should not survive together. Seems like false promise? Like lie to myself." Kai sat down beside her, not touching, maintaining the boundary he'd tried to establish. "Sina, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did." Simple statement. No accusation, just fact. You made yourself essential and then removed yourself, like collective giving connection and then taking away. Same pattern, different source. He hadn't thought about it that way, that in offering connection and then withdrawing, he'd recreated the exact trauma the collapse had caused. The realization felt like accusation he deserved. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be what you need without destroying myself in the process." Sina's tendrils moved slightly, the first animation he'd seen since arriving. "Maybe you cannot. Maybe this is impossible problem. But..." She finally turned to look at him fully. "When you were here, I was not alone. When you left, alone is worse than before. Because now I know what not alone feels like. Before I just had nothing. Now I have absence of something. Worse kind of nothing." Kai felt the truth in that, felt it in his own chest. The 3 days away from her had felt worse than all the years of isolation before he'd known her. Because now he understood what he was missing, could feel the absence as active void rather than just background state. "I don't have solutions," he said. "The work is unsustainable. The dependency between us is complicated. Everything about this situation is impossible." "Yes." Sina reached out slowly, placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. The touch sent familiar warmth through him, familiar sense of rightness. "But impossible things are my specialty. Making things survive that should not. Maybe we are like my flowers. Incompatible but possible anyway." Kai looked at their hands, 3-fingered and 5-fingered, cool skin and warm, alien and human, intertwined. Impossible but happening anyway. He turned his hand over, laced his fingers through hers in the gesture they'd developed together. "I can't promise this will work," he said. "Can't promise I won't break or fail or have to leave eventually." "I know. I promise same things. No promises, just..." She leaned against his shoulder, and he felt the rightness of her weight there, the way his body knew exactly how to accommodate her presence. "Just be here now. That is enough promise." They sat together while the garden slowly died around them, and Kai felt something settle. Not resolution exactly, but acceptance of complexity. They were both damaged, both dependent, both operating in impossible circumstances. But they had this: proximity, presence, the simple fact of not alone that mattered more than all the practical objections. "Help me save the garden," Sina said after a long silence. "Tomorrow. We fix the lights, repair irrigation, make flowers bloom again. Together?" Kai nodded. Together. The next week was different. Kai still maintained corridor duties, still served as intermediary and bridge for desperate Ithari, still carried the weight of being essential. But he and Sina had found a new configuration, not the intense nightly presence of before, but something more sustainable. 3 nights per week in the hydroponics sector. Scheduled time rather than stolen time. Boundaries that were explicit and maintained. They worked on the garden together during these visits. Kai learned the basics of agricultural systems, how to calibrate grow lights and adjust irrigation flow and monitor nutrient levels. Sena taught him in her improving common tongue, patient with his inexperience, pleased when he successfully managed to save a cluster of failing blooms. "See," she said, watching him adjust a light array, "you make impossible things survive too. Not just me, the flowers also." Kai felt something in the work that he hadn't felt during corridor duty. This was active care rather than passive observation. He was creating rather than just maintaining. And doing it beside Sena, their movements developing coordination through practice, felt like partnership in ways that satisfied something he hadn't known was empty. The garden slowly recovered. Lights came back online. Irrigation stabilized. The impossible flowers began to bloom again, their strange colors deepening toward full vibrancy. Kai would stand back and look at what they'd restored, feel pride that was unfamiliar and good. During these evenings, they talked about futures that had been forbidden territory before, the incoming human support personnel, what sustained operations might look like with adequate staffing, whether the Ithari civilization could adapt to permanent neural interface failure, or if some restoration was possible. "I don't think connection will return," Sena said one evening, both of them covered in mineral-rich soil from repotting a particularly delicate species. "Interface is too broken, but maybe my people will learn new ways, human ways, individual together instead of collective together. Is that possible? Can neurology adapt that drastically?" Sena's chromatophores shifted thoughtfully. "Young ones, maybe, like me. We have less time being collective, more flexibility. Old ones, like the Ithari who died, I think cannot change. They are too formed for collective. Remove that. They have no structure left." The implications were dark. An entire generation of Ithari who might not survive the transition, and a younger generation that would have to rebuild civilization on fundamentally different principles. Kai thought about the bonded pairs he'd assisted, the older Ithari with decades of interface connection. How many of them would choose catatonia like the one he'd watched die? "You'll survive," he said, placing his hand over hers where they both rested on the edge of a planting container. "You've already proven you can adapt. Because of you." She turned her hand to interlace their fingers. "You gave me new model. Individual connection instead of collective. You are my—" She searched for the word. "Template? Pattern to follow?" Kai understood what she meant. He'd become example of how to exist as individual while maintaining connection. Not the only example. The other humans on station served similar functions for other Ithari, but for Sena specifically, he was the primary reference point. The thought carried weight, but also purpose. Maybe being template was as important as being intermediary. Maybe teaching adaptation was more valuable than just facilitating communication. The scheduled time together was easier to sustain than the previous intensity had been. Kai slept better, worked more effectively, maintained the boundaries that Chen had insisted were necessary. But he also looked forward to the hydroponics evenings with an anticipation that colored his entire cycle, counting hours until he could return to the garden, to Sena, to the work they shared. On one of these evenings, Chen visited the hydroponics sector. Kai looked up from adjusting a water flow meter to find his supervisor standing at the edge of the garden section, taking in the restored blooms, the organized planting arrays, Sena and Kai working side by side. "I see you found a balance," Chen said. Kai nodded, uncertain what response was expected. Chen moved closer, examined one of the impossible flower clusters. "These shouldn't be able to grow together." "No," Sena agreed. "Should not. But with correct care and environment, they do." Chen looked between them, and something in the supervisor's expression softened. "The incoming support personnel will reduce duty load significantly. You'll have actual time off, real rest. What will you do with it?" Kai hadn't thought that far ahead. The idea of time that wasn't corridor duty or stolen hours seemed almost abstract. He looked at Sena, found her watching him with those large, fractured light eyes. "Maybe we could expand the garden," Sena said. "More sections, more combinations. Show that incompatible things can not just survive but thrive." Chen nodded slowly. "That seems like worthy work." The supervisor looked at Kai directly. "I was wrong before. About boundaries and complications, I think sometimes connection is more important than avoiding complications." Just be careful with each other. After Chen left, Kai and Sina sat together on their usual platform, surrounded by the flowers they'd saved. Sina leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "We are being careful," Sina said quietly. "Yes? Yes. As careful as we can be is enough." Kai wasn't sure it was enough. Wasn't sure careful could protect them from all the ways this could still go wrong. But in this moment, with Sina's warmth against his side and the garden blooming around them, and the promise of actual sustainable existence coming in 6 weeks, it felt like enough, like they'd found something that could last, could grow, could thrive despite being fundamentally impossible. The incoming humans arrived in the 12th week with efficiency that felt almost jarring. 20 new faces, trained specifically for intermediary work, equipped with better protocols and updated understanding of Ithari physiology. They dispersed across sectors, taking over duties that had been crushing the original survivors, and the difference was immediate. Kai's duty hours dropped from 16 per day to 8. Actual rest cycles became possible. The constant exhaustion that had been background state for months began, slowly, to lift. He found himself with free time, hours in the day that weren't corridor duty or stolen sleep or desperate recovery. He spent most of it in the hydroponics sector with Sina. They expanded the garden as planned, creating new sections with increasingly ambitious combinations of incompatible species. The work was meditative, purposeful, satisfying in ways that surprised him. He was building something, creating rather than just maintaining, and doing it with someone whose presence had become as essential as breathing. The new humans were curious about the original survivors. Kai fielded questions about the collapse, about the protocols they'd developed, about how to read Ithari body language effectively. One of the newcomers, a woman named Aisha who'd been assigned to agricultural sectors, visited the hydroponics area to discuss coordination with Sina. She found them working together, Kai up to his elbows in mineral-rich soil, while Sina guided his hands in proper planting technique. Aisha watched for several minutes before speaking. "You two have good synchronization," she observed. "How long did that take to develop?" Kai looked at Sina, found her chromatophores brightening with something like pride. "Weeks," he said. "A lot of trial and error." "And patience," Sina added. "He was very not good at first with plants." Aisha laughed. "The reports didn't mention personal relationships forming. Should we expect that as normal outcome of prolonged intermediary work?" The question was professionally curious rather than judgmental, but it still made Kai uncomfortable. He didn't know how to categorize what he and Sina had. Relationships seemed too simple. Dependency seemed too clinical. Love was the word Sina used, but even that felt incomplete. "I think," Sina said carefully, "when beings spend much time helping each other survive, connection forms, is natural result of proximity and care. Whether that becomes personal relationship depends on individuals involved." It was diplomatic answer, and Aisha seemed satisfied. She left after coordinating schedules, and Kai and Sina continued their planting work in comfortable silence. "Do you think the new humans will form connections too?" Sina asked after a while. "With other Ithari? Maybe. Probably not in the same way. They're not operating under the same pressure we were. They have support, training, sustainable schedules. The desperation factor is different." Sina's tendrils moved thoughtfully. "So we are unique. Our connection," Kai considered. "I think so. We were both isolated in specific ways, both breaking under specific pressures, both finding in each other exactly what we needed to survive." He paused, then added what had been forming in his mind for weeks. "I think I love you, in human terms, not just needing you or being dependent, actually loving." Sina's chromatophores went luminous, the brightest he'd ever seen them. She set down the seedling she'd been holding, turned to face him fully. "I know I love you," said before. "But hearing you say—" She switched to her own language, sounds that were warm and complex, then back to common tongue. "Makes it more real. Makes it not just my feeling, but shared feeling." She moved close, placed both hands on his face, looked at him with those fractured light eyes that he'd learned to read like familiar text. Kai put his hands over hers, feeling the cool texture of her skin, the slight trembling that indicated emotional intensity. "What happens when Earth eventually wants me to return?" he asked. The question had been hovering unspoken for weeks. When my assignment here ends? Sina's expression shifted to something complicated. I have thought about this. Many times. I think, she paused, choosing words carefully. I think I ask you to stay, and I think you must choose. Cannot make choice for you, but I ask. And if I choose to stay, then we continue. Build bigger garden. Make more impossible things thrive. Be together in whatever configuration that means for human and Ithari. And if I choose to leave? Sina's chromatophores darkened slightly. Then I survive. Will be difficult. Will hurt. But I have learned now. I can exist as individual. You taught me that. So I survive, and I remember you, and I maybe find new connections. Not same as you, but connections nonetheless. The answer was mature, realistic, and somehow made Kai love her more. She wasn't demanding he stay, wasn't making her survival contingent on his presence. She was acknowledging the choice, the complications, the reality that their different species had different trajectories. I don't want to leave, he said. That's my truth right now. I don't know if that will change, but right now I want to stay here with you. Building impossible gardens and making things thrive that shouldn't. Sina pulled him close, and they held each other among the blooming flowers, surrounded by the physical evidence of what they'd created together. The garden wasn't just plants. It was proof that incompatibility could be overcome through care and attention and sustained effort. That impossible things could not just survive, but flourish. 3 months after the collapse, Verith Station had achieved a new kind of stability. The expanded human presence meant Ithari could maintain basic civilization without the crushing dependency that had characterized the early weeks. The protocols were refined, efficient, sustainable. Life continued, different from before but functional. Kai stood in the central observation deck, looking out at the starfield beyond the station. Earth was somewhere in that vast darkness, 17 light-years away, carrying a life he'd left behind without much thought. Chen had approached him earlier with official documentation. His tour of duty was technically complete. He could request transport home on the next supply run scheduled to arrive in 2 weeks, or he could file for extended assignment, remaining on Verith indefinitely. The choice should have been difficult. But standing there, looking at stars that meant nothing compared to what he'd found in the hydroponics sector, Kai realized the difficulty was pretense. He'd already chosen, made the choice gradually over weeks and months of working beside Sena, of learning to care for impossible flowers, of discovering that connection, real connection, mattered more than comfort or convenience or familiar ground. He filed the extension request that evening. Chen processed it without comment, but sent a private message. You're sure about this? Kai's response was simple. Yes. The garden had expanded to cover 3 times its original footprint. Sena had submitted proposals to create similar integration gardens in other sectors, teaching younger Ithari how to cultivate life that shouldn't coexist, but could. The proposals had been approved. She would need help implementing them. Kai found her in the evening, working on a new section where she was attempting to integrate an earth species, tomatoes, with an Ithari flowering vine that produced toxic compounds for most other plants. She looked up when he approached, chromatophores brightening in the way that meant she was happy to see him. I'm staying, he said without preamble. Extended assignment. Indefinite term. Sena's tendrils went still, a moment of complete frozen attention, then moved in patterns that indicated profound joy. She crossed to him quickly, wrapped her arms around him with the easy familiarity they'd developed. You choose to stay. With me. With you. For the work, for... He pulled back to look at her. For this. Whatever this is. Whatever it becomes. It becomes what we make it, Sena said. Like garden. We plant. We care for. We help grow. No guarantee of outcome, but commitment to trying. Kai nodded. That felt right. Commitment without certainty. Care without guaranteed results. They'd survived the collapse, the intensity, the complications of being impossible together. They could survive the future too, whatever shape it took. The other humans were integrating more fully into station life. Some, like Kai, were filing for extended assignments. Others were preparing to rotate home when transport came. A few had developed their own connections with Ithari, not romantic necessarily, but meaningful bonds born from the intensity of serving as bridges between isolated beings. The Athari civilization was adapting slowly. Younger ones like Sena were learning individual together existence, building new models of connection that didn't require neural interface. Older ones continued to struggle, some choosing isolation, others slowly accepting that the collective they'd known was gone permanently. It was transformation at civilizational scale, painful and incomplete, but happening nonetheless. Kai and Sena worked in the garden that evening, planting new combinations, expanding the proof that incompatibility could be overcome. Their hands moved in practiced coordination, his larger and warmer, hers smaller and cooler, working together to create space where impossible things could thrive. "What do you think will grow from this?" Sena asked, gesturing at a newly planted section where Earth species and Ithari species were intermixed. "I don't know, maybe nothing, maybe something unexpected. That's the nature of impossible gardens." Sena's chromatophores shifted to contemplative colors. "Same as us. Maybe we grow into something unexpected. Maybe we fail. But trying is the important part, being willing to care for something uncertain." They worked until the grow lights dimmed for night cycle, then sat together on their platform, surrounded by blooming impossibility. Sena leaned against Kai's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, feeling the rightness of her presence. They would continue building together, gardens and life and connection, in a civilization learning to exist in new configurations. Outside the hydroponic sector, the station hummed its mechanical rhythms. Ithari navigated corridors with more confidence now, learning to communicate through gesture and observation, adapting to separation with varying degrees of success. Humans moved among them, no longer just bridges but participants, choosing to stay or leave based on connections formed and purposes found. And in a garden where things grew that shouldn't be able to grow together, two beings from fundamentally different species held each other and watched impossible flowers bloom in the artificial light, proof that care and attention could overcome incompatibility, that choosing to stay was sometimes the bravest form of transformation, that love, however complicated, however uncertain, was worth the risk of being broken. Kai looked at Sena, at the way the grow light reflected in her fractured eyes, at the luminous pattern of her chromatophores, at the three-fingered hand resting over his heart, felt his own heartbeat strong beneath her touch, felt her distributed cardiovascular response through the points where their bodies connected, felt the simple, profound fact of shared presence. "This is enough," he said quietly. Not a question. A statement of truth discovered through surviving collapse and finding each other in the aftermath. Sena's grip tightened over his heart. Yes. This is enough. We are enough. Together. They sat in the garden they'd saved and expanded, surrounded by impossible blooms, and knew that whatever came next, complications or clarity, pain or joy, certainty or continued ambiguity, they would face it as they'd faced everything since the silence fell. Together, imperfectly, impossibly, but with the commitment to keep trying, keep growing, keep choosing each other and the connection they'd built from need and proximity and something that had become, against all odds and expectations, actual love.